All right, welcome back. We're continuing a series on essential JavaScript. What is the bare minimum you need to learn of JavaScript to hit the ground running? We're going to be looking at functions part 2, some more advanced features of functions. So let's take a look. First thing we want to talk about is default arguments. In JavaScript, you can have optional arguments to a function by providing a default value. So I could have something like function optional features optional equals false. If optional console.log, here's your optional message. And then if the optional isn't passed, this will always get logged. Here's our normal message. I need to call this optional features function. And I have a file called functions.js. Node functions.js. Here's our normal message. So you can see here that the only log we got was here's our normal message. And this is because the optional parameter I have here I've preset to false. So it'll always be false if we don't set it. But if I were to pass something in here like true, this true value will get assigned to this optional variable inside this function, and it will now give me both logs. Here's your optional message. Here's our normal message. All right, so that's how default parameters work. You can have obviously multiple ones of these. You could have, name equals some string here. You could have, a bunch of these. So it works basically the same way as parameters. It just lets you provide a default value to start, which makes it optional when you call it here. So that's default arguments. The next one I want to look at is the REST operator. Now the REST operator is pretty cool because it lets you take an indefinite amount of arguments and put them into an array. So we haven't looked into arrays. We'll look more into that later. But basically, if I were to console.log rest, and if I call this function get more, and then I put a few items like 1, 2, 3, what it's going to do is it's going to put all of these into an array for me. So this operator here, this ... puts all of whatever I pass into the function into an array, and then lets me use that array. So if I run this, you'll see I now have an array of 1, 2, 3. What's cool about this is, like, let's say we have 2 that we normally use, and then there's kind of like an optional amount that we use later, like 3, 4, 5, for example, and we run that. Only the ones that we didn't use we can use later. And there's a bunch of things you could use this for, and we're not going to go into that until we cover arrays more in detail, but I wanted to just share that this feature exists in functions, and it's called the REST operator. Not to be confused with the spread operator, which we'll talk more about when we talk about objects. So that's the REST operator. The next kind of category of things I want to talk about is additional ways to define a function. There's a couple ways we can define it. We talked about this classic function declaration here. So my function, or say name, or say hello. You use the function keyword. You give a name to that function. You have the opening and closing parentheses and then curly braces, and you run your code here. We can do this same thing, but slightly different, by setting this as a variable. So say hello equals function. So you might see code that's like this. This is technically called a function expression. It actually doesn't, like the function itself doesn't have a name, but the variable does. So we could do something like console.log hello function expression. And then we just call it exactly the same way. We run it, hello function expression. So that's great. The next thing I want to talk about is hoisting. Hoisting is this concept of allowing you to define a function in a file, anywhere in the file, but you can actually call it before you've even defined it. Let me give you an example. Call hoisted function. So we're going to call it, but we haven't defined it yet. And a lot of programming languages, this would actually throw an error because this variable here or this function doesn't exist yet. But in JavaScript, it does, unless you turn it off in some of your rules, or use something like TypeScript and add a rule for that. Now we'll define call hoisted function, and we'll actually put something in it. This function was called before it was defined, aka hoisted. Now, when we run this, other languages this would error, but in JavaScript, oh, and I have a typo, of course, but it actually works. So that's a concept called hoisting. You could see a function called at the top of your application and not know where the code is yet, and so you can look down and find it. I actually think that this is a nice feature in JavaScript because I can define one function at the top that has my main logic, and then I can have supporting functions defined below. So the first thing I see when I open a file is all of the main logic of my main function, and then I can just look down at any of the functions I call in that code and see the logic if I need it. So I think it's actually pretty helpful. Next thing, so on this topic of how we define functions, this is involved with defining functions, but the next way we can call functions is arrow functions. So let my function equals this is an arrow function. This is an arrow function. This being the key difference, you can see this. It's very similar to the function expression we looked at earlier. Memorizing this and practicing this is a little bit, can take some practice if you're not used to arrows, but one thing to note too is this uses what's called like a fat arrow. It's a thicker arrow, so it has a double equal sign. Some languages have a dash line like that, but in JavaScript you use a fat arrow, and this will also work just like a normal function. It has a few differences. One thing is that it's not hoisted, so it's not brought to the top. But you can see this is an arrow function that runs just as normal. And there's a couple more things you might see with arrow functions because some things are optional. So for example, these braces are optional. It automatically will return whatever is in this if there are no curly braces. So we can run that, still runs. And then if I were to put something in here like a number, let's go with 5. And if I were to run this, we don't see anything. But then if I console.log it, 5 is returned. So it automatically returns. So you can see I could write a function in a very concise way like this. So that comes in handy. It can be more readable if you have a lot of functions that you're defining nearby each other. Another thing is that if you have a parameter you pass in, so let's do thing 1, what we can do is we can actually omit, if you didn't notice, the parentheses around the parameter. This only can occur if there's one parameter. I didn't pass anything in, so let's do hello as my argument. Okay, so that worked. But if I wanted to add a second, so like thing 2, you can see my my compiler's yelling at me, my code editor. And that's because you have to have parentheses if you want more than 1. So finish this off. So this is an arrow function. So you can tell an arrow function can get very concise very quickly by just, if it had one parameter and that's all you needed to do on it, gets very small. So those are arrow functions. There's at least one other way that you can call a function. And without going into too much detail, I'll just show it in case you see it. Tick. So you can also call a function like this with 2 backticks. I have to call the correct function name because I changed it, but you have to call it like this, backtick. Pretty interesting. I've seen it used in styling component libraries, like styled components, things like that. If you see that, you might see this. It has some functionality in it. It's a little bit more advanced, so I'm not actually going to go into this at all. I just want to show you that you can call a function with 2 backticks, which is kind of weird, but kind of cool in the ways it's being used in a creative way. Another thing you might see is something called an IFI, immediately invoked function expression. And I've seen a lot of this in older code or maybe starting a server or something like that. But basically an IFI is, if you think of an arrow function, like this is an arrow function all by itself, but we can't call it. So if we want to call it, we take this same thing and we wrap it in parentheses. So now it's contained, and then we take that same contain function and we can actually call it with parentheses. So if we watch this code, I'm going to have to console log it, but let's see. Like that, it's going to return back this 5. But if I were to do the same thing with these two, let's try running all 3 of those. Only one of them returns it because I only called the 3rd one. So this is an immediately evoked function. The other way you could see this is with the normal like function declaration. So say hello. Hello, and then you'll do the same thing, opening, closing, and then call it. And we'll see that just kind of work. So it's kind of a cool way to start some functionality that you want at the beginning. It also has been used to kind of protect data because it runs the code and keeps whatever state is inside of it. And no other like functions can use it. It preserves its scope. So you can see it used in some different ways. I don't see it a ton, but that is immediately invoked function expressions. And lastly, one more thing, concept of callback functions. Callback functions are functions that are run later by another function. And so a good example of this, probably the simplest example, is there's a built-in function called setTimeout in JavaScript. So we're going to define a callback function. And we'll have it just log. You asked me to remind you about this later. Get groceries. And then we'll do our set timeout. And in here, this takes 2 arguments. The first is our callback, and the second is the time we want to wait. So let's say we want to be reminded in 5 minutes or whatever. We could set that value, and this is in milliseconds. I'm going to have it do 3 seconds, so we see some delay after I hit enter, but then we get our reminder. And so I'm going to call this. I've set this as a callback. Set timeout is going to wait 3 seconds, and then it's going to fire this function for me, and that's called a callback. So let's give it a try. 1, 2, 3. You asked me to write about this later. That's it for functions, part 2. Thanks for watching.